After several months, it's come down to this: a man with a gun. Ho 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 ho. I've always had a special soft spot for Orwell. When I was in high school one year, I was in a very boring history class, and I was looking for something to do, anything to do, and I happened to find a copy of Animal Farm that someone left. Gotta love a sarcastic Brit. They definitely call it as they see it, and that's a good thing for us. But still, even though Orwell doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room here, it's still a great thing for us to look at because, well, it kind of sums up everything we've been doing. Out of all the writers we've had this semester, I think that George Orwell might be the one that has the most pure attitude. And I love that. And that's one of the reasons why I chose this piece to end the semester. But another one is it works as a very good overview of everything we have done to this point. Or at least most of it. And I thought about this when we run across the quote, "A story always sounds clear enough at a distance, but the nearer you get to the scene of events, the vaguer it becomes." I love this quote because it has a real relationship to how we think of interpretation. And if there's a common feature in our readings, well, interpreting our readings has been one of the prime goals of this. And not just so we can talk about our readings, but we can talk about how they affect how we do our own analyses. And they can give us guidance, they can give us models and such. A good definition of interpretation, if we need one, is that interpretation is the revelation of a larger truth that lies behind any statement of fact. And when we talked about arguments and thesis statements, when I brought up the world-defining argument, this is more or less what I had in mind. I didn't know the quote at the time, but it fits. One of the most important parts of interpretation is always perspective. Perspective can change an awful lot about how you view a situation. People in one area don't see things the same way as people in another area. And as we learned from doing the map of UT, there's a whole lot of different perspectives that one can have. And this has been another kind of recurring theme throughout all the readings. Of course, all of our readings this semester have been largely about perspective. We started out the semester by reading on dumpster diving, and the reason I love to start with that one is it's a perspective that none of us really thinks about. When we see people engaged in such a business, we tend to think about them as removed from society, unlike us. So we started out right away by putting ourselves in the perspective of another. When we did mind machines, well, I don't know how many people in this class have experience firsthand with brain implants, but this is definitely a perspective that most people here don't really think about all that much. And putting yourself in that mindset can give you insights that you wouldn't see normally. What about Malcolm Gladwell's piece, Small Change? The role technology plays a role in all of our lives, but we tend not to think about its revolutionary potential all that much. And maybe we should. Mirrors on being a cripple. Well, I know that most students, when they saw the word cripple, immediately had some reactions to this, and immediately probably had certain associations. And if there is ever an instance of somebody who is seen as an other, physically disabled are still very much stereotyped and very much oppressed by our society. What's wrong with the way we work? Well, a lot of you, I don't need to tell this, but in case you haven't worked very bad jobs, this article could be an eye-opener and put you in a different perspective. I think it's a perspective that a lot of politicians and business owners really should think about. The perspective of having to brand yourself.
When we talked about pregame, I said that branding is something that we all do to a certain extent, but still, lots of people tend to think about this as mostly the realm of professionals. How well can we apply this perspective we know exists in others to our own lives? We should. The tyranny of time was another one that got us thinking about an issue from a perspective we don't normally think about. Most people don't think about the time at all, particularly not the way the time is used to control us. And then we had Walter Johnson's Guns in the Family. If you're from a gun-owning culture, that you might know a lot of this, but then you probably wouldn't listen to Walter Johnson's particular point of view in it. If you're not from a gun-owning culture, seeing how his father acted could be a real level of insight for you.
Interpretation largely is about this subjectivity. There are objective truths, and we can get to them. Again, something we talked about when we talked about thesis statements. I can describe the weight of my computer, and the color of my computer, and the dimensions of my computer. Doesn't really tell me much other than the surface level stuff about my computer. We can do it very definitely, but subjective opinions of technology are a lot different because it depends on the person. You can have a bunch of observers looking at reality objectively, and they will see the same thing because that's all there is to see. Subjectively, though, people will interpret things a lot differently. And it's that meaning that we make that I think gives us the most ammunition when we're talking in terms of argument. Because to lots of people, the meaning we make is a lot more real than the objective reality that's out there. See all of the anti-mask conspiracy people. Back to Orwell at any rate. He was writing Shooting an Elephant from a very strange position because he was technically part of the oppressing class, but he hated being the oppressing class, and he empathized more with the people who were being oppressed, even though they hated him as well. How did they express their hate? Well, there was never really an open revolution. No one had the guts to raise a riot, but if a European woman went through the bazaars alone, somebody would probably spit Betelgeuse over her dress. Is this an effective means of rebellion? No, not really, but it is still a way to show some level of resistance. And this kind of activity, trying to show some level of resistance, is something we're all intimately familiar with, because we have all had those bad jobs. And we have to have ways to approach the things that bother us about those bad jobs. There's a definition between strategy and tactics. Strategy is an overall method for achieving a strategic goal, where tactics are sub-strategies, maneuvers and techniques used to achieve short-term tactical goals. So it's the difference between going on a massive strike to improve working conditions and doing things to express your disdain for your situation. And we all do it. In any work you've ever had, you've probably employed some method of showing that you're not 100% completely dedicated to the goals of the organization. Ever taken an extra long coffee break? There you go. Ever made fun of the people who your job relies upon? I know you've made fun of customers. A shocking amount of people steal from work as a means of, well, at least I'm getting a little something back from this. Now, I'm not condoning any of these behaviors, but they exist. And the idea that you have to express your views in some way, shape, or form is one that, as people doing interpretation, as people trying to come to an understanding of subjective reality and how it differs from person to person, we have to at least account for. Another thing that Orwell brought up was that him being part of the oppressing class already defined a certain amount of how he had to act. He had to not be laughed at. He had to maintain an image. An image is something that we're all slave to in a certain way. We can do our best to try to be taken seriously and then blurt out stupid stuff. And we blurt out stupid stuff because we are so interested in and so invested in trying to appear like a normal person that it sometimes short circuits our brain. We can find justifications for our bad behaviors. Remember Logan Paul? The wonderful YouTube guy who did a bit from the suicide forest in Japan where he showed bodies hanging around. Who also, during the Black Lives Matter movement, got in big trouble for participating in a riot, in a mall looting, and he said he was just there to document it. The goal of my memes are to entertain. If I'm trying to entertain, surely it doesn't mean that I should be held responsible. This is another one of those classic non-apology apologies that you see all the time because people need to maintain their image. And the desire to maintain your image, to maintain your position above all, well, we don't have to finish the Orwell piece to know that it's a major deal for him. But the best quote I ever found about it, ol' LBJ, the man has a way with words. While you're saving your face, you're losing your ass. Don't get too overly concerned with image. Hard enough to do, though. And another reason I like the Orwell piece is because he points out that even in the positions that are supposedly above everything else, they have their downsides when you have to try to live up to that image. When the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom he destroys. He becomes a sort of hollow posing dummy. By playing into the roles, by fitting the image, you lose a lot of your freedom, because image is everything. Hey, wait a minute, didn't we hear that from the punks of yesterday and today? And there's lots of images we think of, and lots of roles we think of that seem to be favored in our society. Talk to anyone about masculinity. People who are pro-masculinity, people who are against masculinity, people who want more equity. Masculinity is seen as a dominant position in our society, and there's good reasons for that. I find it a little bit more interesting to look at the ways masculinity can get used. Anything from selling assault rifles. Yeah, they're appealing to your sense of wanting to be a man. To selling being a nurse. It's that image that plays a role in everything, whether we like it or not, that we seem to not be able to escape. And it's hard to escape those images, and it's hard to know that you have to manipulate those images. I've mentioned that I'm a musician, and I've also mentioned that I'm not a particularly successful musician. Part of that reason is because I like the music part of it. I like writing, I like singing, I like playing. You know what I don't like? Marketing myself. I have to brand myself. I hate it. I hate doing outreach on social media. I hate thinking of my stuff as content. I hate the commercialization of it. But if you don't think of the commercialization of it, you become, like me, a musician who doesn't really have the massive levels of success that he would like. I don't even really want big levels of success. I just want to be more successful than I am so people can hear the stuff. Image can be a trap. And even the images that we think of as being exalted can end up being a trap. What's the downside of a good image? Well, what's the downside of being sexy? I should know this one. Being a sex symbol has a really big downside. Being sexy has a really big downside because people only see you as an object of affection, not as a real person. Is it a worthwhile trade-off? Well, I can't really answer that for you, but it can be a dangerous trade-off. British 19-year-old from Buckinghamshire. I know 2 girls with eating disorders who have a huge Instagram followings. One of my grad school comrades had severe rheumatoid arthritis, and she was on different medications for it. One of them caused her to lose just a ton of weight, and she did not really have the weight to lose. And she said the most unnerving thing about it was people kept giving her compliments. She felt she was way underweight and everyone was giving her compliments. It's kind of screwed up, isn't it? Well, what about other identities? Are there downsides to being a badass? Well, always having to prove yourself, I think, would be one of them. Are there downsides to being the funny guy? Not ever being taken seriously, I think, would be one of them. Are there downsides to being the party animal? I think you'd share a lot with the funny guy there. Are there downsides to being aware? Say, politically aware? Well, do we have to go on about how we feel about people who are politically aware nowadays? Lots of society utterly despises anyone who's politically aware. Drain the swamp, after all, right? That's working out well. Anyway, it's all about perspective, the importance of perspective. Everybody thinks perspective is important throughout the academy. Art, visual imagery, perspective is very important. Do you go for 1-point perspective where you can see both sides of the road? Do you go for a 2-point perspective where you have two different things you can look at and you see both sides of the building? Perspective is something that literature people focus on a lot. Narration, point of view. Difference between omniscient narrators and limited narrators. When we live our individual roles, perspective gets to be something that's very, very important. And how you see yourself doesn't always have anything to do with reality. But sometimes it can have some very bad effects. Because identity, which you have no control over, can have some very real ramifications for how the world sees you. Ultimately, perception really is the key. It's the important part of it. Where are you looking at, and how do the different views compete with each other? I think that's what you're going to be writing about no matter what your degree, no matter what your field. It's going to be something that's very important. If you're in business, you need to know the differences between customer perspective and employee perspective and board perspectives. If you're in medicine, being able to see stuff from the point of view of the patients is going to be vital. If you're talking history, well, history is different when you think about the rulers up on high and the people down below. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Knowing that everybody's view is going to be slightly different is going to be one of the keys that's going to help you find common ground with people. And God knows we all need more of that. We'll see you next video.